Roll for Crit is made possible thanks to the support of viewers like you and our patrons on our Patreon page.
You can become a patron for just $1 a month at patreon.com/rollforcrit.
You've rolled your dice and made your character. It's now time to go on an adventure. Role Player Adventures is the newest entry in the Role Player line, where you will actually go on adventure with characters and discover weird stories and maybe uncover the secrets of the world of Role Player. Now, this was a Kickstarter and it technically ended, but there is still late pledges open as of this recording and probably for a little while afterwards, so you still have the chance to pick it up there. Now, for the game itself, we're going to be previewing just the first story here and still try to keep something secret, so we're not going to try to spoil too much for you.
When you play, you will choose which adventure you want to play, although I think it's suggested you play them in order with the same characters. You probably don't want to just go crazy with it, because it is modeled after a role-playing game in a lot of ways. You are progressing through a campaign, your characters will grow and learn new skills as time goes on, you're going to gain new items. It has that same kind of structure to it, but with a fairly different gameplay style. There's, of course, no GM, and there's sort of our skill checks, but they're a little different. We'll get into them in a bit. One player is going to be given the storybook, while another player has the Tome of Encounters. And throughout the game, they will be instructed at different times to look into those books for specific passages that will give them some story, some flavor text, as well as what they need to do and what they're going to decide next. Those roles will shift as the game goes on, so everyone can get a chance to hold the different books and read some of these passages aloud. You're going to be traveling around the board here, and you will move from place to place via your player token, and depending on where you land or what you go through, you'll have to check out different sections of your book. So if you reach an encounter token, you're going to flip it over and it's going to be randomly chosen, and it'll tell you it's this number encounter in the current adventure book that you're on. You'll go there and you'll see what it says. Likewise, if you reach a location, you will visit that place. It will have a specific letter and number assigned to it. It will tell you exactly what is going on there. You'll have some kind of a story. You'll meet some new characters. You'll be asked to make a decision quite often. You may receive items, and then you'll be given the choice of how to proceed. So maybe you can use an item, and each item will have a specific number, and you can, again, look at a passage in the book, and it'll tell you what happens when you use it. Sometimes you can even combine multiple items together to use them, or at least try to, and the book will tell you if you were successful or not. You can also rest, which has to do with after combat or skill checks, you might be tired, you might want to refresh some of your abilities. Just like a traditional RPG, you'll be able to do some of that as well, until you eventually continue moving on through the world, trying to accomplish whatever goal has been set out for you for that specific adventure.
Those choices will sometimes occur in skill checks or combat. You'll have a skill check book, which has different skill challenges, depending on whatever you're trying to do, and they range from levels 1 to 4. Now, on those, they'll show dice with either different colors and or numbers. You're going to need to match these in order to pass the test. Now, depending on your stats, you're going to have a number of dice you're allowed to use, and this is where your skills and those fatigue points we talked a little bit about resting come in. If you don't do anything, you're just going to pull randomly out of this bag of dice, which of course are random colors, which means you might not get the colors you need. You can spend your skill points and put them in the fatigue section in order to guarantee certain dice colors. So if you really need that black die, you can make sure you at least draw one of those. Now, after you get your dice, you're going to roll them, and this is where your items come in. Now, certain items and, of course, your abilities that you unlock throughout the game will maybe let you manipulate the dice, such as treating them as if they're a different color, changing their number, maybe even adding more dice than you're allowed. This will allow you to possibly cover up those skill check dice boxes. And if you cover them all up, you are successful. You've completed the skill and you can read the succeed section. If you fail, then you're going to have to read the fail section, which, for example, for a stealth check, probably means you alerted some guards. What's interesting is pass or fail, or whatever other activities you do, you may actually be told to write down a keyword, because later on, let's say you failed that skill check. When you move on, they may ask you, did you do an alert or an alarm? If so, read this section. So your actions will have consequences. Now, battle, very similar. You'll have a creature, and sometimes they'll have a modifier. It's sort of like a keyword, meaning they're brave or cowardly. And you can probably guess by the keyword, it may make it easier or harder for you. They'll have a number of dice over to the right side of their portrait here. And you're going to try fill these out. But unlike the skill check, you don't need to do it all in the first round, so to speak. You don't have one big roll. However, every round you are unable to defeat the enemy. This box is going to move over one, and you're going to take some damage by the use of fatigue tokens thrown into your fatigue box. Should you ever reach or succeed your max health, that means you've been knocked out. And of course, there'll be extra damage depending on which dice boxes you weren't able to cover up. So you'll want to be careful because sometimes it's not simply just filling it out. You may want to cover up those ones that do more damage in order to make sure you can last longer in the fight.
At the end of an adventure, you'll have accumulated a bunch of experience points and gold coins, and you'll be able to spend those on new items, new cards from the marketplace, or possibly on upgrading your own character's stats. You'll have to decide somewhat as a group how you're going to spend those before you move on. Now, this game is not just called Role Player because it's part of that franchise, it's also called Role Player because it can directly connect with the original Role Player game. Rather than using one of their pre-generated characters, you can, if you wish, translate a character that you built in Role Player to this game. So in the original Role Player, the whole game is about getting different dice of different colors and putting them into your attributes, your different stats, as well as accumulating items from the marketplace, etc., etc. And they have a system to translate all that stuff into this, so you might be starting with a slightly different amount of health points, you might have better charisma stats, for example, but they do it in a way that is fair, so that it's not, you can't really be too overpowered or too weak, although, maybe not quite as balanced as you would be if you all just went with the pre-generated characters. But this is, if you're willing to jump into that, have a little fun with it and see what happens. There also are copies of all the items from the original Role Player in this game, so whatever you ended up with back then, you'll be able to find those in this new game, perhaps with some additional tweaks or symbols on them for how they work in Role Player adventures. So it's a very unique thing. We just tried out the pre-generated characters, but if you are a fan of Role Player, I think that will add an extra layer of fun to it and make it feel much more personalized for you.
We wanted to stick with the pre-generated for the most part because we wanted to talk about this as if you're just buying this base box, because some people may not have the other things. And I think as of now, we can say you're still safe. The pre-generated characters never felt like, man, I don't want to play with this guy. I mean, I still want to play the role player character because I think that game's great, but I don't think it was like a disappointment at all.
Yeah, I think that's a cool bonus, but I never would feel like you got, like, that's the true experience. It's just kind of a fun little idea that if you're really into it, you can do that, but definitely not required. The game itself was one that we had been anticipating. Of course, we love Role Player, and we also love storytelling games and role-playing games in general. So it seems like this is going to be the perfect marriage of those two things. And having just played through the early parts of it's just a preview copy, so things could change before the final game comes out, I was very satisfied with what they gave us. It was pretty much what I expected it to be in a good way. The story, it's still the early parts, but I feel like while it's definitely set in a D&D inspired, very much so world, the things that were happening didn't feel super cookie cutter. I thought there are some interesting paths that things could go, and the fact that our choices that we made, even just in the first few rounds of the game, seemed to make a really big impact, is something very special and very intriguing to me.
It's got a lot of things I love too. It's got you actually keep track of factions, so depending on where you're at there, your loyalty or disloyalty to them will change the choices you actually have, and I really like that a lot because it really helps you feel like you're part of the world.
Yeah.
And another big thing, which I feel bad for them for having to do all this, is the items. Because sure, you can think about like, yeah, if you have the key, open the chest. We've seen that in a lot of things. The way this works, though, is you have to purposely think, okay, let's check using item 85, let's say. But you could sometimes be like, you know what? I want to see what happens if you use the the bottle of blue flames with the key, which of course makes no sense. But they still wrote a paragraph for that. And there could be consequences and penalties. Sometimes it's just funny flavor text. And I love that it prepares the party to be able to be a little bit weird and stupid with their item things. But in turn, that also means you'll be rewarded for coming up with clever combinations, or maybe lack of combinations as well.
Yeah, things may change in later sections and if you get more dangerous consequential items, but I found that you weren't really punished that harshly for just trying things out, which is something I really look for in games that are like this, that are centered around story and exploring areas and narrative, is that I don't want to feel like, oh, we're on a time limit, and sometimes maybe you are in different ways, but it didn't
Not
feel
as hard
super.
as some other games.
Yes, it felt like we had freedom to try stuff.
In fact, it seemed to reward us for backpedaling a couple times to do more exploring. And, for me, that's a big deal. Jonathan and I are the kind of people who in a video game like to search every corner. And, in other board games, which is understandable, I'm not saying like it's a terrible thing, but they put a timer there so you have to sort of focus on the path and you can't do everything. And this is sort of like, you know what, just do what you want. Have fun.
Like an RPG.
Right. Whether you want to come in pre-generated characters or you want to play role player first, which I will say I'm really curious now how it's going to be to play role player for like, all right, this is the character you're going to bring in. Because I feel like it's going to change the aspect of how we choose which items to play and grab. And they're really cool how they do it. If you've ever played role player, there are certain item sets for usually like armor pieces. And in this one, we saw some of those and be like, for each one that has the mystic title in there, they're going to reward you for using them. So it's really cool to see that. And we should mention, by the way, because I know you said original role player, but this does reward you for expansions too. So don't feel like because you got Fiends and Familiars that you won't be able to use your familiar in this.
There's familiars in there. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a relatively simple system the way it works, but I thought it was very clever how if you go back to a place, it'll say there's ways that it'll remember, have you been here before? And if you were, what choice did you make when you were here? And it really does, as you said, make, in addition to the factions, make you feel like you're part of a living, breathing world. And also it's very good at walking you through it. Like it really teaches you as you go for that first game, and it's not a very complicated game. I think even compared to just regular role player, maybe it's because we have that experience, but I felt like it was pretty intuitive, and even a group that if they're just familiar with RPGs maybe, or they haven't played many tabletop games, the story really walks you through and teaches you stuff when it comes up. And I liked that a lot. I thought it worked well. It doesn't just overwhelm you with a whole bunch of rules right up front. We'll see how things develop throughout the later adventures and exactly how complicated the story gets, if there's any kind of other new stuff that gets added to the mix. In terms of mechanics or alliances or roles between players. Could go a lot of different ways. Again, you can still back this as a late pledge up through early 2021. I will put a link in the description, even though the official Kickstarter is done. And it's set for, at this time, release sometime next summer. So early impressions are very positive, very, very strong, and very excited to experience more of this story. You can also try some of it out on Tabletop Simulator. I think they've just got the first one at least, the first adventure up on there. So take a look and try it out for yourself if you want to, if you're not convinced by us.
Let us know if you're excited for this and trying it out, and if you've actually already made maybe your character and role player. You're like, I've done this, it's set, they're ready to go. Let us know how that turned out and who they are.
Yeah, talk to us in the comments section right down below. Till next time, I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Will.
And this has been Roll for Crit, doing role player adventures. Support our Patreon, like this video, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.
Watch more of our content now to hold back Cthulhu's madness.